Welcome to the Discourse on Bharata First. I'm Pereira. Since you're here, please like, share, and subscribe as well so that more people get to know about us. All right. The G20 is no longer G20, but G21, so to speak, thanks to India for the inclusion of the African Union into the grouping. Now, this comes as a major win for India's G20 presidency, among others, since a message was sent to the African nations that we are with them. Through this, we managed to stay true to our tagline, One Earth, One Family, One Future. In this edition of the Discourse, we will analyze the African Union and G20. Joining me on the program today are Ambassador Suresh K. Goel, career diplomat, and Amalendu Misra, Professor of International Politics, Lancaster University. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of the Discourse. Ambassador, let me start with you first. How would you look at G20 welcoming on board nations of the African Union, well represented as well? What does this really mean?
Well, if you ask me what it means, I can take the whole next 1 hour or 2 hours, depending upon how much time do we have on this issue. But I will try to be very, very brief in this particular case. And if I just leave in between, it is with the hope that there'll be further questions on to cover what I may not have said, and there will be a lot. If we look at the inclusion of African Union in G20, still it's called G20. There has been no formal change in the name. I do hope there will be a change sometime or the other. But G20, or effectively G21, right from the beginning, Frank and Professor Misra, if you recall, right from the day one, and in fact, even before we became G20 president, the speculations, rumors, expectations, in fact, I would say, were rife that during India's presidency, African Union would be able to join G20. And I think first indications how serious we were about this was given when Prime Minister, after taking over the presidency of G20, the very first political or the very first diplomatic act that he did was to hold a conference of the Global South, Voice of the Global South. And when he did that conference, Voice of the Global South, obviously African Union was represented there. It was quite clear that one of our very fondest action would be how to get African Union into onto the forum. And there was a need for that. I mean, I think if I will not go into the mechanics of it, there were several countries who were not quite that keen on this actually happening. Very obvious, really, the remains without name. But there were several countries who probably were not as keen as India was, and as the other countries from the South were. But eventually they agreed with India's plan, and that indicates that many countries, in fact, a majority of the countries in G20 was sympathetic or were understanding of India's plans or India's wishes in that regard, in as much as they went along with India's game plan on the paragraph relating to Ukraine and Russia. Similarly, on the case of African Union also, they went along with India's game plan, and that was one great accomplishment. As to why African Union, economics apart, and I think because economics is the whole issue here, I will come to that in a little later with other questions. But if you recall, right from our days of independence, 47, we became independent. The very first act of Prime Minister Nehru, as the Prime Minister, was to start sharing our whatever we had, our resources, our expertise, if we had any, the resources we were building up, IITs, IIMs, etc. He opened them to Africa. They were there for the world. They were there for the dispossessed or the disadvantaged world to make use of in India also. And we started ITech program. We started various programs of technical assistance, technical support, partnership, capacity building with developing countries or least developed countries. Most of them were from Africa. But more than that, in 1950s itself, we became the foremost country active in decolonization movement. And it was as a result of India's efforts that we had in the United Nations a committee on decolonization, whose charter was based entirely to decolonize countries in the world. Most of them were in Africa. And it was as a result of the efforts of that committee that eventually in 1992 or 93, I think, that the Committee on Decolonization was disbanded in United Nations, not because it didn't do the work, but because this was one committee which had completed its work. And therefore, there was no more mandate for the committee to follow. And India was traditionally always the chair of the committee. Initially, the work on removal of apartheid structures in South Africa began in the Committee on Decolonization. It was only later that there was a difference made between ending apartheid in South Africa and decolonization. And then we had a special committee against apartheid. And again, it was a recognition to India's ideological and political efforts in this area, that always India's representative in the United Nations would be the rapporteur of the Special Committee against Apartheid. And when I was there in the UN from 91 to 95, I was the rapporteur of the Special Committee against Apartheid. And therefore, it was my fond privilege in 1994, before Mandela came and spoke, to announce at the floor of the UNGA that apartheid has come to an end in South Africa. Those are proud, and even now when I remember those times, it's such a hair-raising kind of a thing, exciting time. So ideologically, politically, economically, in terms of sharing expertise, development, growth, India has always been with Africa. And therefore, the question for me would be not why India is trying it now. Why did India not try earlier, even when it was not the president, to bring Africa Union or African representative as Africa into the G20? It is just like that when we talk about Security Council reforms now, while we talk about four, etc., all the formulations, we never stop there. We always end, and there has to be a country from Africa in the Security Council. So I think the moment then came in G20, because we were the president and we could work more actively and more intensively in that direction. And then it happened. Great moment, really.
Yeah. Absolutely a great movement, and so much more to talk about. We'll continue to discuss the economic aspect a little later on, Ambassador, but let me bring the professor in now. Amalendu Misra, what does this mean, really? The ambassador so eruditely put it across to us as to, what Africa means to India. But what does the inclusion of the African Union into the G20 really mean for the African Union and the African nations?
Thank you very much for that question. First of all, when you talk about any kind of organization or institution or forum, it is building a wall. It is like separating entities from one another. So when you talk about G7, when you talk about G20, or you talk about SAARC or ASEAN or any kind of international forum or institution or organization, it is always trying to make that us and them divide. So the problem with that is that if you're not a part of it, then you are missing out quite a lot. It is always about, it is for us. We are the ones who want to get a large share of that particular cake. So in this particular instance, the reason why I'm giving you this example is very simple. what has happened in terms of African Union becoming a part of G20. Until now, G20 was an exclusive club. It was an exclusive club of rich nations, rich groupings such as European Union, and it had no place for underdeveloped or developing economies. So that was the divide, that big divide, that great divide, which did not allow for almost a population similar to that of India, 1.4 billion Africans, to be a part of this particular grouping. So what G20 has done is break that barrier. I would look at it in that particular context. It does not recognize, it sort of gels well into the spirit that Prime Minister Modi has talked about, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that whole world is our family. He's breaking down those barriers. He's breaking down those barriers between us and them. So when you are embracing the whole of Africa as a part of G20, you are making a statement. It is not only a philosophical statement, but it's also a practical, economic, and political statement. Now, let me delve a little bit more into that particular aspect. Mr. Ambassador has very elucidated very clearly in terms of how India has been a pioneer in terms of making a case for Africa, be it decolonization or be it in terms of scientific and educational development. Ever since India managed to free itself from the shackles of colonialism, that was in 1947. So between 1947 and until now, there is a big gap. Of course, in the 1950s, India was taking a very proactive role in terms of Africa's developmental initiative. We know about non-alignment, we know about how Nehru and Nkrumah and Nasser, three ends, were a party to that in terms of anti-imperial ideological stance and so on and so forth. But that particular discourse, that particular narrative, that particular spirit got lost after these initial big leaders left the scene because of their death and so on and so forth. Africa also entered into a new trajectory because from democracy, it entered into a period of dictatorship, military coups, authoritarian rules, and so on and so forth. So from 1960s until 2010 and so on and so forth, it was a period when Africa itself was in turmoil. But luckily, Africa has managed to come out of that. And it is one of the fastest growing continents in the world at the moment. It has got a better economic index compared to Latin America or Asia or Europe for that matter. The growth may not be in double digits, but its growth is better than what European Union is doing in terms of registering GDP growth and so on and so forth. So let's not forget the fact that African economy is about $3 trillion, the GDP. And we're talking about 1.4 billion people. And we're talking about 55 nations who comprise of various religions, various cultures, and so on and so forth. So to keep them out of any of these grouping, to say that you are not a part of us, that you cannot be a member of this high table, was discriminatory. It is almost similar to the apartheid. So whenever you talk about G7, India has aspirations. Mr. Ambassador touched upon the question of the reform in the Security Council. Why does India feel that it has a genuine grievance? That in spite of being a fifth largest economy, in spite of having a 1.4 billion population, in spite of being such a massive power, it doesn't get its credence when it comes to Security Council. So that specific angst is also something similar that we can see in the context of Africa, if we put our feet into their shoes, so to speak. So what has happened in this particular context is breaking down that particular barrier, which had kept that percentage of humanity away from any kind of developmental mechanism, any kind of discussion surrounding education, surrounding culture, surrounding connectivity, surrounding IT, and so on and so forth. India itself has been doing that bilaterally. India has been engaging with African countries as a summit level, but it has its limitations. India gives almost 30,000 scholarships to African students to come and study in India. India has expanded its diplomatic presence in almost 47 African countries from 32. So, by bringing African Union into a forum such as G20, it is also putting the onus on the other 19 members to look at Africa in an equal footing, to
Right.
make space for Africa. And that is the beauty of this particular initiative that we saw. And let's hope it is leading to outcome, great results.
Absolutely. A place at the table is what everyone is vying for. The tables may be different, but a seat is what everyone is looking for at the end of the day. And let's hope that something comes out of this as well. The expansion, let's call it G21 for now. All right, Ambassador, let me bring you in now. From an economic perspective or an economic point of view, this is massive and it's important, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to economics and nothing more than that.
Quite right, Frank. And I think in this on this particular question, I will need to go back to a bit of history again. I think Professor Misra did raise it, and he talked about the kind of leadership that came into Africa, the problems which came, coups, etc., in Africa, which didn't allow Africa to really function as a new country, as a new continent, power, etc. I think there were several reasons for that. Do you recall that, in fact, even when we became independent, there were several pushes and pulls, and basically because once you get used to controlling countries, it's very, very difficult to give up that power, because eventually when you control the country, you control the resources, you control how the resources are used, you control how people function, how they study, education, all kinds of things. Now, I happened to be there in New York, and therefore I witnessed how these political countercurrents and currents worked. 1991, after the Cold War had ended, and you remember that there used to be a phrase there called the peace dividend. Mm. And the peace dividend was supposed to be that at the end of the Cold War, now the resources can be used for development and growth of countries rather than to the war, and therefore now the era is done for development of the countries, particularly Africa, Latin America, etc. Boutros Ghali, the great son of Egypt, had become the Secretary General of the United Nations with the support of USA, incidentally, and eventually evolving support of France. Then he became the Secretary General, and he developed this great instrument of sovereignty, or the power. How is power going to be exercised through this multilateral forum called the United Nations? It was called the Agenda for Peace. Agenda for Peace, yes. And Frank, 91 to 93, within those 2 short years, we saw all those dreams crumbling down, vanishing in thin air. Would you remember when did the war in Angola begin? Please recall, when did Somalia begin? Remember, when did Rwanda happen? Now, Rwanda was not before 91. And who were involved in Rwanda? Who were the power in Rwanda before the genocide happened there? Without naming the countries, most of these countries continue to operate as they continue to operate today. Mali is a good example. Niger is a good example, because most of the countries who were actually governing these countries before still could not give up their desire to obtain resources from these countries. Uranium from Niger. You want to develop alternative sources of oil. The oil market is very tight, so either you get it from the Russian Federation or go to Mali. Help Mali to develop their oil resources. So for their own economy. Ravan built his Lanka on the gold that he got from India. The same thing operated there. They wanted to build their own Lanka on the gold from these African countries, and therefore Africa could never see peace. Africa would never ever see the economic growth. The only countries which remained the kind of beacons for growth were South Africa, which developed basically for entirely different regions by the Africans and the British. Zimbabwe, because it had been there under the British control for a long, long time, but that didn't happen. Simply because the economy didn't take root. And therefore, it was essential that the economy should take root in these countries. Frank, please do let me know when I exceed my space. I tend to become very passionate about Africa.
No, it's good. It's good to see that passion, Ambassador, because it brings out, some great discussion points, and so, we get a ground reality as to what exactly is happening there. But thank you for pointing these aspects as well.
Yes. Let me carry on, and I will, because now I'm coming to the fact, so I will be brief now here. So economy had to be basically paid attention to. Again, in 2009, G20 as a forum of finance ministers had already begun in the earlier, was it 1998, I think sometime around there, when that time the financial crisis took place. It became a summit in 2007, after the Lehman crisis and everything. When G20 was established, G20 became a real platform of developed and developing countries' large economies, not just large developed economies, but large developing economies, which could facilitate a real dialogue between the two to ensure that the world does not plunge into that kind of a crisis once again, by ensuring financial stabilities of the multilateral banks and the financial institutions, so that there is some stability in how the funds are transferred between each other. Incidentally, you will be surprised to know that even in late 90s, there was a thought being given by some countries, and I will not name the countries and who, etc., to creating an economic security council. Because by that time, it had become pretty obvious that unless there is a body in the United Nations which has powers similar to Security Council to ensure economic development and growth in these countries, the UN will remain a kind of a wish unfulfilled. So there was a call, not a call really, it was still being talked about in murmurs to have an economic security council. It didn't happen. So G20 became the effective economic security council, not security council, economic council, where the real world of nitty-gritty could meet and talk about things. So once that happened, then the opportunity came for Africa to be part of that process. Now, why Africa? Pretty obvious. Africa is the most resource-rich continent in the world. You can't think of minerals, whether it is iron ore or it is coal, it is alternative sources of energy, agricultural land, anything. Food security, if you want to give shape to food security, Africa has to be part of it. And unless there is food security, you will have instability in the world. So Africa contributes to the economic stability of the world. Africa contributes massively to the economic productivity in the world through the minerals. When Prime Minister Modi had gone to Africa 3 or 4 years ago, I forget the number of years, but we talked about actually doing agriculture in Africa with the help of seeds from India and then picking up production from there for Indian markets. So this kind of an engagement, interdependence, is the way to go really for the development and growth of African continent. Therefore, G20. G20 is the only platform in the world which provides this kind of a thing. the call for smaller groupings, Professor Misra mentioned about walls. Argument always has been, look at the UN. Is it effective? It's a kind of a universal organization, yes, but is it effective? Almost everybody will tell you that's not effective. So if you want to have an effective organization where you can take actual decisions, you have to find a way that majority of countries are represented, even if not making it unwieldy. So Africa Union representing 55 countries, even with one voice through the chairman, is a litmus test.
Right.
Therefore, for an effective economic integration of the world, there can be no better alternative than Africa Union.
Absolutely.
Frank.
Absolutely. All right. Professor, let me bring you into the picture once again. Now, let's talk about another aspect here, because we've seen that the Chinese footprint has gone up tremendously, the last decade or so, especially in the African Union and in African nations. By adding or by bringing in the African Union within the ambit of the G20, does this also allow other players and the other members to sort of try and balance things out in Africa, and so that the African Union doesn't become too China-centric?
Since you mentioned China, let's look at what are Chinese footprints in Africa. India, of course, has a kind of deep cultural roots in Africa. The relationship goes back even to 2 millennia, Bronze Ages. And we can also talk about the cultural relationships in terms of many African leaders who sort of were part of India's ruling elite during the slave sultanate, if we go back to that particular period in history. And we also have what you may call African settlements in parts of India, especially in Karnataka. People don't talk about it, but we have got a healthy African population who are Indians, but genetically at least they're Africans. So India's footprint in Africa has been a long, and let's not forget the contributions that many Indian traders had in Africa during the colonial period, especially in East Coast, in Mozambique, in Kenya, and Uganda, Tanzania, and so on and so forth. Now, to sort of fast forward it, the Chinese footprint in Africa is very recent. It starts only after the African decolonization process. China wanted to have a footprint because it wanted to have its ideology present in that part of the world. And that is the reason why it started exporting its ideology and as well as some developmental network in Africa. And it built railways in Tanzania. It provided lots of loans to countries such as Zimbabwe. But that wasn't enough until 2000. What is happening around the year 2000 is that the international community, especially Europe and United States, do not have much interest in Africa. And that is the period when China slowly and steadily makes inroads into Africa. Because why? Because it's thinking long term. China wants to develop, but it doesn't have the same degree of resources, as Mr. Ambassador has already pointed out. Africa is resource rich, not only in terms of minerals, but also in terms of food. And China has a growing population. They don't even have enough jobs. So China does it very surreptitiously. It creates conditions in Africa which allows for Chinese development, not African development, but Chinese development. All these infrastructural projects in Africa are investments coming from China, but here people who are working there are Chinese. So if you're talking about deep water facilities, it is manned by the Chinese, it is worked by the Chinese. And what it does is a negative development in terms of pushing Africans out of the developmental network, fishermen losing their traditional fishing rights in various places. Africa plundering the natural resources. Countries such as Mozambique, countries such as Madagascar have been sort of decimated because of their natural forest resources. because of the Chinese demand for logs and all the rest of it. And the minerals also, you can talk about the same. So while China gives, while China is involved in a big way in Africa, I'm talking about $255 billion investment in Africa in 2021. It has not necessarily percolated down. It has not actually helped Africa's developmental network, developmental process, because as we know, there is a lot of corruption there. And most of this money that comes from China goes to the top elites. They are the ones who are siphoning off the money and so on and so forth. So while China has got a massive footprint in Africa in terms of developmental network, in terms of government to government contacts and so on and so forth, it doesn't have the same degree of fellow feeling that Africans have towards India. Indian diplomacy in Africa is people-centric. It makes a people-to-people level contact, which had been the case for hundreds of years when Indian traders were present in Africa. So that is the big divide. Although Indian investment in Africa is minuscule compared to what the Chinese have been doing, but it has got a much bigger footprint in Africans' hearts. And that is something very important. So China is being caught red-handed, so to speak, because of the deceit, because of its promotion of corruption, because of the way it is looting the resources left, right, and center.
Right.
And India, luckily, hasn't been put into that particular category, at least by the Africans until now. So, which is a great thing, and which is something to build upon, especially in this context when African Union was embraced by Prime Minister Modi and by the G20 family in particular.
Very true. Very true. All right. Time to get quick closing comments now from both the panelists with what next and the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
All right. My closing comments really will focus on China once again. China gained in its presence in Africa basically because it had the capacity to spend money on infrastructure development in Africa. In the process, there was a negative development because there were Chinese people, as Professor Misra has already explained very beautifully. Therefore, a situation then came when the ideological support, ideological friendship with India slowly began to give way to a greater presence of China in African countries because they were able to bring resources for investment. And all said and done, when you need money, you need money. I mean, that time you're hungry and therefore you need food. And that really worked in favor of China. I would say that Chinese, because of their huge surpluses, are still in a position to undertake larger projects in Africa. Therefore, we will need to keep reminding ourselves that if African countries were to go the way of China simply because China is able to invest huge resources in Africa when the other countries who can afford to do it do not come forward, we will be losing Africa once again. So while we have got Africa as member of G20, what we need to make sure is that this membership does give them advantages in terms of economic growth, does give them share in the resources from multilateral banking institutions. And we need to be very cautious this time that we do not lose Africa once again. To repeat what I said before, it's very, very important.
Very true.
Thanks.
That's absolutely important. We can't lose Africa because they are such a big part of what is to come in the future. All right, Professor, close the show for us with your quick concluding remarks.
Well, Africa has been treated very patronizingly by the international community all these years. The white man's burden being one of them, and in more recent times, Africa being called as the dark continent. Africa cannot take care of its own affairs and so on and so forth. So here is a big opportunity for India to stand shoulder to shoulder with Africa, open itself up to Africans as citizens, open its economy to Africa in terms of free trade agreements, open institutions, educational institutions all over Africa, not to teach Hindi, but to give the expertise in which India excels, scientific technology, providing them with all sorts of latest technologies and so on and so forth, to make them realize that India is there for the long run, not to have their resources, but to genuinely see them as equal brothers in the developmental mechanism, because India has been through that all these years because of European colonialism and so on and so forth. So that genuineness has to come from India in terms of policy undertakings. We don't need to have big pockets, but if we do some work genuinely by opening up Africa for the international market, then that will endear India before the African eyes, and that will endear into the future where India-Africa relationship is going to go from leaps and bounds.
Very well said, Professor, and a good way to close the show as well. Thank you to both my guests, Ambassador and Professor, for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Much appreciate your time.